Welcome to this rapid revision session, the second on Nazi control, this time focusing on propaganda. As with last time, I'd like to remind you that it's basically impossible for me to promote or monetize this sort of material, but it is really important for the GCSE course. It would therefore be really appreciated if you could like this video, you could share it in whatever way you can, and if you could subscribe to the channel. It'll all help it promote it to other students and make sure that as many people are helped as possible. Okay, let's get into it. Control of Nazi Germany was organised through two main themes. On one side there was terror, control through fear. This is where people who would not willingly follow or believe in Nazi orders would be terrified into inaction. This was led by Heinrich Himmler and was the subject of the first video on control. On the other hand, we've got propaganda. As many people as possible must be convinced, indoctrinated and fooled into supporting Nazi ideas. Joseph Goebbels was put in charge of this, and it is propaganda that we'll be focusing on in this video. Let's get into it. There were three main methods by which the Nazis controlled people by propaganda. The first was censorship. This involved the control and banning of messages that went against Nazi beliefs. This controlled the information that people had access to and stopped them from being influenced by ideas that the Nazis worried worked against them. The next was by propaganda. This works like adverts for ideas. Rather than preventing messages getting to people, propaganda creates and controls those messages. Goebbels believed the best propaganda does not reveal itself. It works invisibly, penetrating every cell of life in such a way that the public has no idea of the aims of the propagandist. And then there was control by art and culture. The Nazis had narrow views of what art was acceptable. To them, Germany should keep to traditional art forms and reject art from other cultures and countries. This meant rejecting jazz with its African-American roots, rejecting modernist and expressionist art that questioned ideas. Instead, traditional German music like Wagner's operas were promoted. It's helpful to get some information about Joseph Goebbels himself. Hitler appointed Joseph Goebbels as his Minister of People's Enlightenment and Propaganda in 1933. Goebbels was different from the stereotype of the Nazi leader. A childhood disability had prevented him from serving in World War I, though he was still infuriated by Germany's treatment in the Treaty of Versailles. He was an academic and not a thug. He graduated as a Doctor of Philosophy in 1920, specialising in linguistics and public speaking. He was himself a powerful speechmaker. More typically, he was a vicious anti-Semite and hypocrite. This photograph was taken on the same day as the previous one, and shows Goebbels scowling at the photographer on discovering that he was a Jewish man. While he promoted traditional family values, he personally was a regularly unfaithful womanizer. He was, though, an able organiser. He also embraced new technologies, like radio and film. So what propaganda methods were used? The first and perhaps most obvious was the use of the press. There was no free press in Germany. All had to print Nazi ideas. In return, the government effectively communicated with newspapers, but only with information that suited them. All other information was subject to strict censorship. A newer method was radio. In the 1930s, radio was still new and novel. Like with newspapers, radio stations were subject to censorship. Goebbels ensured Nazi speeches were broadcast, and public radios were put in schools and cafes. Cheap People's Receiver radios were produced, resulting in 70% of homes having a radio. They were designed not to pick up signals from other countries, although in fact Germany had the highest level of radio ownership of any country in Europe. Another was with public rallies. Rallies had been effective in election campaigns, and with Hitler in power they continued. They were choreographed to impress and give the impression of order and strength. In Nuremberg, a purpose-built stadium could hold 200,000 people with banners, huge searchlights and Nazi sculptures. But also sport. Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympics, and Hitler turned it into an opportunity to showcase German cultural and racial so-called superiority. At the time, the world was impressed. Germany won most medals. Sports events also featured Nazi songs and salutes. Sport fit the Nazi idea of promoting brutal competition. Here you can see a football team giving the Nazi salute before an international match. It's now that I regret to tell you that that's the England football team. Yes, for a time, the Nazis even insisted on visiting teams giving the Nazi salute. The next issue we'll look at is the Reich Chamber of Culture. Goebbels headed a department responsible for controlling art and culture, ensuring it aligned with Nazi ideas. This process of bringing into line various aspects of public life was called Gleichschaltung. The Chamber of Culture controlled film, theatre, art, literature and more. Its focus was on producing art that harked back to traditional values and presented a favourable or sanitised version of German history. Also art that promoted Nazi ideals such as struggle, discipline, sacrifice and loyalty. Suppressing art that went against these ideas or that promoted other ideas or cultures was also part of the Reich Chamber of Culture's job. The Nazis exerted control over cinema too. Film and cinema had flourished in Weimar Germany, giving the Nazis something of a head start. 250 million Germans went to the cinema in 1933, so Goebbels was determined to turn film to his advantage. Nazi films were made and commissioned, carrying anti-Semitic messages which are often deeply dehumanising, such as the film The Eternal Jew. Long newsreels of Nazi so-called achievements were shown before all films. And all films were subject to censorship and approval. Even drama and entertainment films often had hidden meanings. One wartime film, for example, although it was never widely shown, was about the sinking of the Titanic. But the hidden meanings was to make all of the Americans and British look cowardly and capitalist, and they inserted a fictional German hero. Cartoons were also used. Hansi the Canary was a character based loosely on Mickey Mouse. The character slightly resembled Hitler with its slicked over hairstyle, and was shown being attacked and mocked by Jewish crows. Leni Riefenstahl became the Nazis' favourite filmmaker. Her films promoted the Olympics in 1936, and her film Triumph of the Will promoted the Nuremberg Rally. The films were technically advanced and very impressive for their time, although of course the message that they carried was truly awful. There was also control of the visual arts. All painters and sculptors in Germany were required to be members of the Reich Chamber of Visual Arts. Those who refused were forbidden from teaching, making, displaying or selling their art. Artists were also subject to surprise inspections by the Gestapo, adding to a climate of fear. Art galleries were also inspected. 12,000 paintings and sculptures were removed from display, especially modernist or expressionist pieces like those by Picasso and Cézanne. Separate art exhibitions were held, with so-called degenerate arts. This showed art from other cultures or art that simply the Nazis disapproved of. Instead, the Nazis promoted art that showed traditional scenes or those that promoted Nazi ideas, such as this family scene. You can see a picture of Hitler on the wall and they're listening to one of the people's receivers. It's called The Führer Speaks and was painted in 1939. That wasn't all though. There was control of music. Music was largely controlled on a racial basis. Jazz had its origins in black American culture. It was banned as so-called degenerate. The work of Mendelssohn was banned as he was part Jewish. On the other hand, the work of Bach, Beethoven and Wagner was promoted as traditionally German and promoting German heroism. Literature was also strictly controlled. All new books had to be approved and censored by the Chamber of Culture. Books that were judged to be anti-Nazi were banned. 2,500 authors had their work outlawed. University libraries were purged of books by Jewish or communist authors, including Einstein. These books were publicly and symbolically burned. There was also the impact on architecture. The Nazis hated the modernist design and architecture of the Weimar Republic and rejecting the Bauhaus ideas. Instead, they focused on architecture that was grand in scale and imitated the styles of ancient Rome, with pillars, arches, eagles and domes, giving a historic and empire-building impression. Grand government buildings were designed, many by Hitler's favourite architect, a man called Albert Speer. Our final points then. Consider this interpretation by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum about how Nazi propaganda worked. The arts and culture were not exempt from this effort of Gleichschaltung, bringing ideas into line with Nazi beliefs. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, immediately strove to bring artistic and cultural communities into line with Nazi goals. Goebbels' propaganda efforts controlled Germany through bringing people to agree with Nazi ideas. Goebbels believed that propaganda was best when it was subtle and complex. the Nazis censored all media, including newspapers, film, radio and literature. Propaganda influenced sport, promoting Nazi ideas of competition and strength. Art had to be approved by the Nazis. Art that went against Nazi ideas was banned and often ridiculed as so-called degenerate. Rallies, architecture and paintings were designed to promote ideas of strength and unity. The work of people who opposed the Nazis, such as Jewish authors, was suppressed. So bearing this in mind, do you agree with this interpretation, that Goebbels had total control of art and culture? Or perhaps we could argue that they didn't ever get total control. After all, some groups deliberately embraced foreign cultures. And there was the need for the Nazi terror organisations, presumably to frighten those people who would not be convinced by Goebbels' terror and propaganda. That concludes this rapid revision video. Remember what I said about subscriptions and liking the videos really helping promote the work. So if you are able to do that, that'd be much appreciated, especially given that this subject material is impossible to monetize and promote. But I really hope it's still been useful to you. If it has, do bear in mind that I'd really appreciate your help. Thanks very much for watching, and best of luck with the rest of your studies.